Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining me. My name is Radmila Cholic-Popovic, and today I want to talk about what happens when we look at web accessibility not as a checklist, but as a culture. The title of this keynote is Behind the Checklist: Human-Centered Accessibility and Assistive Technology Integration. Let's see where we are headed today. We'll start by looking at the shift from legal requirements to lived experience, then briefly ground ourselves in the compliance standards that shape our work. From there, we'll explore accessibility as culture and how assistive technology only thrives within supportive relationships and environments. We will walk through 5 practical strategies from my research that help move us behind checklists. And we will end with why this shift matters for students' dignity, communication, and belonging. Over the next few years, public schools in the United States will come under new digital accessibility requirements under the 2026-27 ADA Title II final rule. The rule clearly defines what digital accessibility means through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, level AA. These mandates extend civil rights protections into the digital environment, but they also create a new tension. And this is because the law can set a standard, but it cannot guarantee understanding. It can ensure that a student's screen reader works, for example, but it can't ensure that a teacher knows what it feels like to rely on one. And this is where human-centered accessibility begins, at the intersection of compliance and culture. My comprehensive exam work explored these from 2 angles. In CE3, I looked at how these mandates shape assistive technology integration. And in CE4, I focused on the cultural side, how accessibility becomes sustainable only when language, attitudes, and relationships evolve alongside the technology. Today's presentation is grounded in that second area, assistive technology and society, but it draws context from both CEs. So let's start with the compliance side. ADA Title II and WCAG 2.1 together form a framework for equity. They established 4 core principles: that content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. In the context of education, these principles ensure that the websites, learning platforms, testing systems, and communication tools that students use every day must now be accessible to all. The law compels schools to think about accessibility earlier in the design process. It encourages vendors to create products that work with assistive technology. And it reminds administrators that accessibility is not an optional courtesy, it is a civil right. But there's the limitation. Compliance defines what must be done, not how people experience it. For example, a website can be technically perceivable and still feel exclusionary, or an accessible document can still use language that diminishes the very student it was meant to include. So it is possible that compliance guarantees access on paper, but not in practice. To understand what makes accessibility human, we have to talk about language, culture, and design. Language is the bridge between policy and people. It's not decoration, it's infrastructure. In my district, I developed the Disability Language and Etiquette Guide to help educators, staff, and students talk about disability in ways that promote dignity and agency. The guide starts from a simple premise that words shape belonging. When a teacher describes a student as nonverbal, it unintentionally centers what that student cannot do. But when the teacher says multimodal communicator, it reframes the same reality through capability and independence. That linguistic shift changes how teachers support the student, how peers respond, and even how the student perceives themselves. Inclusive language is, in essence, a form of assistive technology. It's the software that runs in the background of every human interaction. In my paper, Disability Language and WCAG Mandates, I argued that inclusive communication should be embedded within accessibility training itself. Because if we separate the technical from the human, we risk building accessible systems that no one feels invited to use. Consider how often accessibility training stops at the technical. Add alternative text, provide captions, ensure keyboard navigation. These are essential, but incomplete. So what if every compliance training also included a short segment on disability inclusive language and how to speak respectfully to people who use assistive technologies? That small addition could shift entire institutional cultures. Human-centered accessibility asks us to see the user not as a compliance requirement, but as a collaborator. So let's zoom in on assistive technology itself. Historically, AT was designed as compensation, a way to fix individual deficits. But as the World Health Organization point out, assistive technology has evolved into an ecosystem of enabling tools that benefit everyone. Speech recognition, captions, predictive text, these were once niche accommodations, and now they are universal design features used daily by people with and without disabilities. That evolution tells a story. Accessibility works best when it's not separated from mainstream design, but when it's seamlessly built into everyday technology. However, the success of AT still depends on how people relate to it. A number of research shows that students sometimes reject AT because they fear stigma, and stigma is the social cost of being seen as different. So even the most advanced device can fail if the environment around it hasn't changed. That's why human-centered accessibility is not just about the device, but the ecosystem, the teachers, the peers, the policies, and yes, the language that surrounds it. We can meet every WCAG standard and still create digital isolation if we don't address these social factors. So how do we move from a compliance mindset to a culture of accessibility? Across my projects, I identified 5 interconnected strategies. The first one is embed disability language training within all compliance effort. If staff understand both the technical standards and the human meaning behind it, accessibility becomes part of identity, not obligation. Second, audit not just technology, but communication. When schools review websites or public documents, they should also look for ableist phrasing or exclusionary tone. For instance, does the district homepage celebrate inspirational stories that unintentionally portray disability as tragedy? Or does it present students with disabilities as ordinary members of the community? Third, foster interdisciplinary collaboration. And true accessibility happens when AT specialists, speech language pathologists, IT staff, and administrators share a common vocabulary. In many districts, these groups work in silos, but accessibility doesn't live in one department. It is a shared ecosystem. Fourth, prioritized strength-based language in education. The way we describe students shape how we teach them. Language that highlights capacity encourages growth, and language that centers on deficit discourages growth. And finally, commit to continuous learning. Accessibility is dynamic. It's not a one-time goal, but an ongoing conversation. Together these strategies build accessibility as culture, where every policy, decision, and lesson plans reflect the shared value that inclusion is non-negotiable. Let's talk about the why. Why should busy educators, developers, and administrators invest in this deeper work when compliance already feels heavy? Because accessibility is ultimately an ethical commitment. It is inseparable from dignity. When people are excluded, digitally or socially, the cost is not just functional, but moral. Every inaccessible document communicates something, whether we mean it or not. It says you weren't in the room when we designed this. And conversely, every accessible, inclusive communication says, we saw you, we thought of you, and we built this for you too. And that's the heart of human-centered accessibility. It's not just about functioning technology, it's about relational ethics. The educator and philosopher Don Norman once wrote that good design is invisible. I would argue that inclusive design is the opposite. It should be visible, celebrated, and continuously improved because it reminds us of who we are as a community. Accessibility doesn't stop at national borders. In my C4 analysis, I compared how mandates operate across regions. Despite differences, a shared theme emerged. Every framework eventually confronts the same question: how do we turn legal obligation into cultural participation? So whether in California or Ontario, Australia or India, compliance creates the structure, culture makes it sustainable. And there is a generational story here too. The technologies once designed as assistive, such as captions, voice commands, touch screens, have become everyday features for all users. This mainstreaming shows that inclusive designs doesn't just serve a few, it future-proofs systems for everyone. So where are we headed? As we move into the WCAG 3.0 era, the focus is shifting from rigid criteria to adaptable experiences. Artificial intelligence, personalization, and multimodal interfaces will transform how people access information. And that evolution makes human-centered design more, not less important, because no matter how advanced technology becomes, it will always reflect the assumption of its creators. If we don't build empathy into algorithms, they will replicate exclusion at scale. This is why assistive technology professionals, educators, and policymakers must stay anchored in human stories. When we design with empathy, accessibility stops being an accommodation and becomes a shared norm. So let me ground this in a concrete example. Imagine a district adopting a new digital curriculum platform to meet ADA Title II requirements. The procurement team runs a compliance test, color contrast, keyboard navigation, captions, it all pass. The contract is approved. A few months later, a student using a switch interface can't complete assignment without help because the platform's timed quizzes reset before their switch input registers. So technically, the platform was accessible, but functionally, it wasn't. Now, imagine if during procurement, a student who uses a switch or an AT specialist had been part of the review. Imagine if the team had also applied the language audit to its training materials, replacing phrases like special learners with students with disabilities. That's the difference between a compliance process and a human-centered one. It's not about extra work, it's about deeper perspective. Accessibility at its core is relational. It's the relationship between people and technology, between words and meaning, between law and lived experience. When those relationships align, technology becomes transformative. When they don't, technology becomes another barrier. That's why my framework from compliance to culture is built on relationships between federal mandates like ADA Title II and local implementation, between professional training and daily communication, between policy language and the language of empathy. Each connection brings us closer to each other. As I close, I want to leave you with one thought. Compliance ensures access on paper. Culture ensures access in practice. The future of accessibility will be written not only in code or policy, but in conversation, in how we talk about disability, how we design for diversity, and how we listen to the people whose access depends on our choices. If we can integrate inclusive language, human-centered design, and strong policy frameworks, then assistive technology will no longer be something we give to students. It will be something we build with them. Accessibility will cease to be a technical achievement and become a cultural identity. So I invite you to take this message back to your schools, your design teams, your organizations. Ask not just, is this compliant, but does it connect? Because the real future of accessibility and of assistive technology isn't about checking boxes, it's about building belonging. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.